Just getting the YouTube live stream set up, almost there. Green, it is good. Very nice. Right.
We are in the Mishnah 4, correct? Or 5?
No, I think we're on Mishnah 6.
Oh, okay.
Chapter 12, Mishnah 6 of Yevamot, because we talked about the. Oh no, you're right. We did Mishnah 4, where we had the minor and the deaf mute, but we haven't done Mishnah 5.
Now, the law of conversion is also in Yevamot?
Yes.
Because I was listening on podcast about conversion, about the parasha of the week for Yitro, and they say, oh yes, and they started talking about the different rules, and they named Yevamot. I say, oh, something interesting on that Masechet. Nice.
Well, we did actually cover a little bit of it. The Talmud goes into much more detail than the Mishnah. But earlier on, we talked about the status of people who are converts and their relationship to each other when it comes time for a potential levirate marriage. And we talked about if the brothers had been born before the conversion or after conversion, or one before and one after, and the fact that they don't have a legal connection to each other. And the rabbis in the Gemara go into much more detail about a conversion in general, beyond the narrow issues of Yevamot.
Okay.
So it's a digression, if you will. A lot of people don't like the way the Talmud starts with one topic and then moves into other considerations that aren't connected to the official title of the Masechet of the book. Personally, I love it because that's the way my own mind works. And it's sort of, as long as we're talking about X, let's talk about Y, because it's really similar to X. And you reminded me of X, or you reminded me of Z. I think that's a very organic way to organize ideas. But yes, that's how we end up with the issue of conversion in Yevamot. But again, most of the discussion is in the Gemara, not in the Mishnah.
So I need to wait for the Daf Yomi.
Yeah, well, we'll get there. We'll get there. Not this week, not this month. It's going to be a while, but it'll come around. And of course, you can always cheat and just look it up in the daf in advance. It's okay to study something, with a little bit more focus. Daf Yomi tends to be kind of a running review of the Talmud. It doesn't give you enough chance to stop and really study anything in depth. So I recommend picking a few topics and looking at them with a little bit more detail and commentary, rather than just keeping up with the Daf Yomi only.
For the second
when you have free time.
For the second cycle, when I finish the first one, then yes. No, I started now today the 929 project. They started Yoav.
Nice.
Started Yoav, so it's started today also.
Doesn't it take 7 years to finish the Daf Yomi cycle?
7.5.
Exactly. 7+.
Yes. And we are in 1 and a little.
1 and a little, because we started during the COVID lockdown last year.
Before, I think.
That's right. We started doing that's right. We started before COVID because you guys were meeting in the library on Sundays.
Correct.
And then we moved that to the virtual review on Sundays.
Yeah. So I think I started around February or end of January or something like that.
Yes, exactly. I remember it hadn't gone long before we ended up with the lockdown.
Yep.
All right. So I think that's a nice digression to start with. Like I said, that's the great thing. When you're really learning and you're open to the topic, you never know where it's going to end up. And that's a good thing, because that means you're going to discover things that you weren't looking for. And that kind of serendipity, to me, has always been the most enjoyable type of study, where you just suddenly come across a diamond of an idea that you didn't even know you were looking for. All right, so we are picking up in chapter 12 of Yevamot, Mishnah number 5. We only have a couple left in this chapter, and then we're going to get to a new topic. It's one we've touched on a little bit, but it's a new topic sort of altogether, and that's going to be in chapter 13. That was my teaser in the WhatsApp commercial I did just a few minutes ago. So if you're tuning in for what I advertised, you're just going to have to hold on till we finish chapter 12, but I promise we'll definitely get to chapter 13, at least starting it tonight. So 12:5. If she performed Khalitza before 2 or 3 judges, and one of them is found to be a relative or disqualified as a judge for some other reason, her Khalitza is invalid. Right, so it makes perfect sense in general. If there is a inadequate witnessing, either by a compromised witness, meaning a relative, somebody that is too close to the matter to give fair testimony, even if their testimony is known to be accurate, we still don't accept it. And if the person has some other flaw that makes them as unqualified, for example, if they are if it's revealed that they are a professional gambler in an age when gambling was, as a profession, often subject to much crookedness and pressure upon people for paying their debts, which, by the way, is actually still the case in many places where people try to be professional gamblers, except in some very isolated fields these days. Okay, so if you don't have the right number of judges, it didn't happen. Yes, Aaron.
The gambling thing, I didn't think they had to be professional gamblers. I thought they just had to engage in gambling on a regular basis.
Well, that's the idea of regular basis. If they are known as a gambler, meaning somebody who is looking to this not as a recreational activity, but as something that actually makes up part of their income, then they are considered a professional. It's the same way that in the modern world, if someone says that they are an artist, if they just draw pictures and share them with people or not, that's one thing. If they are a lawyer, but they also sell their paintings on the weekend at the farmer's market, then they are a professional artist. That they may not be making their full salary off of that, but they have the right to call themselves a professional artist if they are doing it for pay.
Yeah, but I thought a lot of the gamblers are just addicted gamblers who are actually losing the money gambling. And I thought
I didn't say that they would be always making money. I'm just saying that they consider it and they engage in it as though it were a profession. And yes, there are many who call themselves professional gamblers that in the grand scheme of things are definitely losing money to the activity rather than making it. But the same is true also for many artists. People who spend a lot on their paint canvas and knowledge of painting don't always sell their artwork for the actual value of everything they've put into it. All right, so that's the generic case. Now we get some side cases. Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan the cobbler validate the Khalitza in this case, meaning they say, actually, it would still be okay even if only one of them was disqualified. And then they bring a case study, which is traditional to do if you have one, to try and make your point. An incident occurred involving a certain person who performed Khalitza between him and her alone, meaning not in the presence of other, because they were in prison. And the case came before Rabbi Akiva, and he validated. Now, the Gemara goes into more detail about what this case might have been. The way they break it down is that this was the man and woman were in the prison with Rabbi Akiva, whom you may know was imprisoned by the Romans, and that they did Khalitza in front of him, but the witnesses were outside of the prison, but they were still watching the event unfold. So that in the Gemara is why Rabbi Akiva allowed this to take place. So it's a rather unusual set of circumstances, at least we hope, not to have to do things in prison like this all that often. This always reminds me of the story of the prophet Yirmiyahu, the prophet Jeremiah, who engaged in the redemption of land for his relative, even while he was imprisoned for daring to speak against the corrupt government of the kingdom of Judah in the last days of the first temple. the halacha and the need for continuing it even in the face of great adversity has been one of our strong suits. That we don't just say, times are tough, who cares? We say times are tough, I guess it'll be tougher, but we'll still do it. Questions or comments before we move on to Mishnah 6?
Yeah, Rabbi, so Akiva, there were no witnesses then. There were zero,
Well,
right?
Well, so not exactly. So like I said, according to the Gemara, the Gemara's understanding of this, there were witnesses, but they weren't in the room because, prison, but they were still observing it from through the window. So there were witnesses, but it wasn't your typical witnessing.
And is that what we were talking about before with the minion, how they were talking about between the window doesn't actually count?
Exactly. When we've talked about constituting a minion in unusual circumstances, the topic does come to: are you in the room, out the room? Are you there? Are you not there? Depending upon visibility, audio, and all of those other things, which is a much longer conversation that you and I have had, but we're not going to rehash it tonight.
All right. And what's the ground for why this was validated? Was it because they saw it and they accepted the testimony, or?
Yes, essentially because there were witnesses, even if it was not the ideal form. Much like the concept we talked about before of lehatchila and b'deavad. Lehatchila, from the outset, you would never organize your witnesses to be in a different room. But b'deavad, in this case, it was considered to be acceptable in order that Khalitza could be done and the woman and the man be released.
But how is that
from each other, not necessarily from prison?
Yeah. How is that proof of the proof and related to the first paragraph? I should say the first statement.
But you mean in terms of the relatives or disqualified judges?
No, in terms of he said it was valid while the other one said it was invalid. And they give this example as proof that it could be valid.
Right. So this is one of those things that in a Talmud class we would have more time to discuss. That what the Amoraim, the sages of the Talmudic period, are basically doing is they are reading and elaborating on Rabbi Akiva's statement as not as a proof text for Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan's, but in fact as a counter text to what he said, to what they said. That it may sound like in our Mishnah that Rabbi Akiva is building off of Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan, but in fact, he is saying under certain circumstances, normal judges judges that normally would be disqualified because of distance can work, but it still has to conform to the basic principles of not being a relative and not being disqualified for some other reason. So it's a clarification of the core principle and a refutation of Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan.
But how does it refute it? Because isn't the rule still that if they're related or you don't have three judges, it's still invalid?
Right, but he is qualifying that even if the judges are not normally considered to be the way they should be, like outside the room, that under these circumstances, it would work. So he is refining the idea of being disqualified to not disqualify the particulars of his case. So it reinforces the first opinion by providing an example of an exception that proves the rule. And again, in a full Talmud class, that's something that we'll see, maybe someday we'll be able to do it. That's something you'll see a lot more often, where the sages of the Talmud, the Amoraim, are often using additional teachings, what are called braitot, to clarify the positions of the sages, or sometimes using logic to clarify the positions of sages, often by referencing other teachings of theirs, either in the Mishnah itself or other braitot, other early period materials, and drawing them together to create a more consistent, logical, holistic understanding of the sage's opinion. But that is much more of what the Talmud does, which can often make the Mishnah look like it's being interpreted opposite of what your surface reading might be. as good a place as any to remind people that just like when we're reading the Torah, our surface reading shouldn't be our final reading. So too, when reading the Mishnah, our surface reading shouldn't be our final reading. And one of the big jobs of the Talmud is making sure that our surface reading is not the last reading that we stop with. All right. Let's go ahead then and move on to Mishnah number 6, which we're going to have to slide down here. And we're going to do a little bit more about the actual ceremony. So we've done a bit of the ceremony with the sandal and all of that. Now we're moving into a more complete picture of the events. The Mitzvah of Khalitza is performed as follows. He and his Yevamot come to the court, and the scholars of the court give him advice appropriate for him, whether to enter Levirate marriage or to perform Khalitza. As it is stated, how do we know that this happens? And the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. So what this is implying is that the elders will counsel him of what would or wouldn't be a good idea in this case. We've talked sort of off and on about the idea that Khalitza was generally preferred, but there were occasions when they would encourage Yibum, the Levirate marriage. And this is where we can see the people of the town tilting the scales in one direction or another as the advice of the community will help influence the decision. Now, ultimately, it is still the decision of the young man and the young woman, but this is the chance for them to give them advice. And as you can see from Deuteronomy 25, that advice is built in. And if they decide to perform a Khalitza, which is what we're doing in chapter 12, she says, my brother-in-law refused to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He did not wish to consummate the Levirate marriage, Deuteronomy 25:7. And afterwards, he says, I do not wish to take her, Deuteronomy 25:8. And they would say these statements in the sacred language, meaning Hebrew, and not in any other language. So what this is trying to remind us, which we touched on much earlier, is that these statements were done in Hebrew because they are a very strict formulaic quote from the text of Devarim, of Deuteronomy itself. And so each of them have to play their part according to the explicitness of the text itself. And once it has been established that indeed they are going to do Khalitza, and that she has said the right statement and he has said the right statement, confirming all of that, afterward the shoe is removed and she spits before him. As it is written, how do we know this? His Yevamot shall approach him before the elders and remove his shoe from his foot and spit before him, which is the very next verse in Deuteronomy, which indicates that this spittle must be visible to the judges because it is literally before the judges, before the elders. And she shall respond and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. So, everyone following the ceremony so far? All right. Up until this point, the judges would prompt the parties to recite the text that they are required to say, meaning that the judges would be helping them. Just as in a modern wedding ceremony, the officiant, the Masada Kedushin, will instruct the parties of what to say under the chuppah to make sure that the formulas are done correctly. So too at this time, all the more so because it had to be done in the precise phrasing of the book of Devarim, the judges would make sure to lead them to make sure they use the right statements, the right formula.
So Rabbi, sorry interruption, but so
no, it's not an interrupt.
She lose and take the shoes from his leg, or only lose it?
No, she removes it.
Remove completely with her hands.
Yes.
So she needs to do that, not him. She.
Correct. She does that.
Okay.
All right, and now we're going to see the way that
did she return after that, after the ceremony, the shoe?
Yeah, he gets his shoe back. Yes.
Okay. That's cool.
And when Rabbi Hyrcanus once prompted the participants in Khalitza under the Ela tree in the village of Etam, he prompted them to finish reciting the whole Torah passage. After which they established the custom of completing the whole Torah passage. What does that mean? Therefore, they continue and say the following verse, and his name shall be called in Israel the house of he who had his shoe removed. So that is the next section, which technically is not part of the strict reading of the halakha of what needs to be said, but he introduced the custom of following through on the reading from the Torah so that the entire description would be there, and that became the custom. That became the accepted practice to include that additional phrase as well. And this mitzvah of saying, the house of he who has his shoe removed, applies to the judges, but not to the students of the judges and other onlookers who are present. So what this means is that the judges would say the phrase that was just described, talking about the one who has had his shoe removed. The judges would make that statement, but only the judges, according to this opinion. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, said, nope, in fact, it is a mitzvah upon all who are present to say, he who had his shoe removed, that everybody has to join into that statement in conclusion to the act of the rite. And for those wondering the scorecard, Rabbi Yehuda wins this. For those also who are following in a Hebrew copy or a slightly different translation, you'll note that it's the Khalitza Na'al is repeated 3 times at the end of this Mishnah, even though this particular translation doesn't say it 3 times, but indeed it is the practice to say it 3 times. Questions or comments before we move to a completely different topic? I mean, little overlap with Yevamot or Yibum, of course, but very different than Khalitza for what we've just done.
Any special reason why 3 times and not twice or something like that?
So 3 times is generally considered to be a more binding legal declaration. It's one of the reasons that you'll be familiar with of why we recite Kol Nidre 3 times. The recitation of Kol Nidre 3 times makes it a clearer statement of legal import in a way that cannot be misunderstood. Chapter 13. All right. So as I mentioned in the WhatsApp commercial that I put out a little while ago, everybody knows that the main plot point, the surface main plot point of Fiddler on the Roof is Tevye trying to find husbands for his 3 daughters, at least the 3. So is that true? Was there matchmaking, and what were the rules of matchmaking? Well, it is definitely true that there has been matchmaking in Judaism for a very, very long time, pretty much as far back as we can find. The first incident of matchmaking that we know of explicitly is the matchmaking between Adam and Chava, between Adam and Eve. Of course, they didn't have so many people to choose from. The more famous example of a human level of matchmaking is the selection of Rivka to be the bride for Yitzchak, Rebecca and Isaac. And then later on, of course, with Lavan and Rachel and Leah, we see more examples of that. Later on again, we see with Zipporah and marrying Moses, we see that Yitro plays a very important part in that. So we do see examples of matchmaking, and very often examples of the father of the woman playing a very significant role. Now, that probably seems really, really weird to the modern world, and indeed that was one of the running subtexts of the whole Fiddler on the Roof play and the original stories, that people are not really so keen in the modern world with the idea of matchmaking, especially with an idea of coercive matchmaking. But you will notice that from the stories that we saw, especially famously in detail of Isaac and Rebecca, that Rebecca is given a clear choice of whether or not she wishes to go and return to Canaan and to marry Yitzchak. And so the question is going to be in our chapter 13 about the right of refusal. There's still more introduction I got to get through, though. and I apologize for making long narratives, because there are two different versions of matchmaking for a preteen. This is matchmaking for a minor. For an adult person, no matchmaking at all can happen without the woman's consent, or the groom's consent for that matter, although that was taken as a bit more explicit. But for a minor, there are two forms of matchmaking. There is matchmaking that can be done by her father, which is believed to be biblically permitted. However, that matchmaking, she does still have the right to refuse when she reaches the age of majority. However, as we've touched on briefly a few times prior in Yevamot, a girl without a father, meaning a girl whose father has passed while she is still a minor, can still have a match arranged for her by her mother or by her brother. However, that match does not have the same right to status. It does not have the same Torah status, and therefore she is free to refuse that match even while still a minor. However, there are still some ins and outs that need to be navigated in that situation of exactly how does she do that? What is the status of her refusal? Does it count as a divorce? Does it not count as a divorce? Elements such as that are going to come up in chapter 13. So I just want to make sure that we got it clear. It's going to be fine from our translation as well and reinforced there. We're dealing with the case in most of chapter 13. A few times we'll contrast it, but for most of chapter 13, of a young woman, preteen, who is not of bat mitzvah age, not the age of being an adult, who has had a match made for her, a betrothal, at least, if not an actual wedding, to somebody else, and done by her mother or brother because her father is dead. So that is our standard case that most of chapter 13 is dealing with, ish. Okay, everyone got the ground rules? Like I said, you got to love the Mishnah. It assumes you already knew all of this before it starts in chapter 13. Because remember, these are review notes. You're not supposed to be learning from scratch for this. All right, so let's see what happens in our argument between Beit Shamai and Beit Hillel. Remembering Beit Shamai and Beit Hillel are two different schools of tradition and interpretation from the ancient world in the end of the Second Temple period and onward.
Hey, Rab, I had a question about that.
Yes.
Just out of curiosity, how come the two schools became so separate and distinct? How come you couldn't mix up positions?
They became separated and distinct, mostly according to tradition, because they didn't listen to their teachers well. That there were a few minor cases of disagreement between between Hillel and Shammai themselves, the actual founders, but the vast majority of the places where we see disagreements are between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. The students of each school were not up to the same caliber as the founding teachers. And that meant that oftentimes they would remember partial teachings or draw the wrong conclusions from teachings in a way that left them in conflict. And then they had to reconcile those conflicts in order that there could be a unified position for the community.
But there wasn't a middle school who was kind of like in between, didn't just side with one school or the other?
Oh yes, there were other schools, but these were the two dominant ones.
Oh, so the middle was pretty low then, huh?
Well, I hate to use the term middle because we're not talking about a spectrum of opinion where one is at 0 and the other's at 100, and so someone else could be at 50. We're talking about interpretive traditions where they either have deduced or think they remember a certain answer to a certain question. And although their answers may be opposite because, one says yes and the other says no, that doesn't mean that there is necessarily a middle position which splits the difference. It doesn't quite work like that.
By middle, I meant you don't just always side with Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. I meant middle as in you more impartial, I probably should say.
Well, it's not unaligned might be another way of saying it. So absolutely, there are unaligned positions that don't conform to either of them. And indeed, we see those positions crop up sometimes in the Mishnah and a lot more in the Talmud as well, to try and help clarify the positions of what exactly they're arguing about in the first place and resolving the apparent disagreement and reaching a conclusion. So yes, there are definitely non-aligned, neutral parties, if you will, that are not in either of the two schools, but who nevertheless have their own traditions, sometimes which matches one, sometimes which matches the other, and sometimes is completely different.
Right. But by the time you get to the Talmud, though, they're I'll say the loyalties to one school or another has, for the most part, gone away, right?
Yes, I mean, there's still discussion and debate, about the opinions of these schools. But not only has Beit Hillel more or less dominated the final analysis, but if you will, Beit Akiva has dominated as the next major generational shift. It's probably a little bit more than we want to talk about tonight, but Rabbi Akiva also represented a particular branch of interpretive tradition, and his branch became dominant during and after his lifetime. So there were alternatives, and the other alternatives essentially will wither over the centuries and not be followed by the majority of those keeping Judaism. All right, so the sages decreed that in the case of a minor girl whose father died, her mother or brothers may marry her off. However, such a marriage does not have the same legal status as the marriage of an adult. Therefore, if the minor regrets having married, she is allowed to make a declaration of refusal to her husband, thereby annulling the marital bond. Now, it's important to understand that we're talking here about a girl who was a minor, who was married off, who gave her consent at the time, but then is retracting her consent while still a minor, right? So right now, the whole timeline is pre-bat mitzvah age.
I thought that at the end was after bat mitzvah that she can refuse.
In this particular section of Yevamot, we're dealing with the implications of refusal before adulthood.
Oh, okay. So everything is before. Okay. Thank you.
In this particular case. But yes, there are implications of what happens when she becomes bat mitzvah and makes a decision there as well. But in this case, we're talking about what happens if she was married and then refuses while still being a minor. So in that case, the sages disagreed with regard to the details of this halakha. Beit Shammai said, only betrothed girls may refuse. What does that mean? A girl may refuse upon reaching adulthood to remain married to the man to whom her mother or brothers married her as a minor after the death of her father. However, by implication, although this particular commentary translation doesn't say it, if she had actually been married, then she would not be allowed to refuse. That level of bond would not be removable by a mere refusal by the minor. Instead, it would take a full get, a full normal divorce to dissolve the relationship between them. Now, interestingly enough, the argument the argument that they start getting into eventually is about whether or not people would want to get married if the girl could dissolve it this easily. That it would be a problem. You have gone through all the trouble of having the wedding, of having the feast and all of that, and she's still a silly little girl. And then she says, you know what, I've decided I don't like it, but thank you for the party. Then people might choose not to go through with a betrothal or even the marriage if it's a minor, because of the chance that it may just be disappear into smoke. As we're going to see, Beit Hillel has a different opinion, which is I like his idea, but we'll get there in just a second. But
it's a good point. Like, why someone want to betray and marry a minor? Like, really, like 11 or like. Okay,
so
that's a question.
So quick reality check. When a girl would be betrothed and married as a minor, that did not mean that she immediately moved in with her husband And it definitely didn't mean that they began to have relations. So we're not talking about this being an act of sexual intercourse with her being this young. Instead, marriage in the ancient Jewish world, well, really in the pre-modern Jewish world, like most of the world, was not about romance. It wasn't about attraction. It was about what works best for the family. And what worked best for the family would sometimes be, I need to secure this relationship now while she's young, because if I don't, they will marry her to someone else. And I need to secure this relationship because it will help me financially. It will help my family socially. It will help this family socially. She needs to have somebody support her. Maybe her family can no longer support her. By marrying now, the husband can be a means of support to her and perhaps the family as well. There was an intricate web of social, economic, and communal relationships that were all tied up in marriage, which was why people didn't just walk around through the field, see somebody pretty, and get down on one knee and say, will you marry me? But that families and communities were involved in these decisions. Yes, in the modern world, thanks to our luxury of having a much stronger material culture that allows us to survive without desperately needing a partner to struggle side by side in the field against the craziness of the world, people can take their time, people can wait longer, they can wait until they think they have an emotional connection, and then begin to build a relationship off of that. Which, by the way, is not always more successful in the long run, which is a whole nother topic. Not that I'm in favor of arranged marriages per se, but the one advantages of most arranged marriages was once it got going, people sort of felt committed to the relationship for reasons other than I just liked being with you. And that meant they actually worked harder to like being with you. If you feel that you have to be with the person rather than I can walk out the door and open up Tinder, then you will work harder to make the best of the relationship you've got. And as I mentioned in a sermon just a few weeks ago, absolutely, many times divorce is the right answer, but so is working to improve your contribution to a relationship, which many of these arranged situations would strongly encourage a greater investment by both parties to make the relationship work well. All right. That was Beit Shamai, Beit Hillel, but Beit Hillel says that both betrothed and fully married girls may refuse. So first of all, the basic logic is that we don't have the right to take away her right to refuse. That this is a rabbinic level of bond, unlike if the father himself had made the arrangement, and therefore she can refuse. It's her right because her mother or brother don't have the authority to make it not her right. As far as Beit Shammai is concerned, that if you didn't protect the husband from the fickleness of the potential bride by saying that she had to refuse prior to the marriage, they say, you know what? Men like to be married. Men like to be known as a husband. They like the status that comes from that. And so men will still go ahead and try to get married. And I think he was also hinting, we'll try and make it good. But if she refuses, she refuses. So yes, people will still get married even if you give her this right. But that isn't really a right that we have the right to take away. So yes, competing rights have been an issue for a very long time. Okay. More disagreement between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai say refusal may be directed only at her husband and not at her Yavam. What does that mean? In such situations, she must perform Khalitza in order to dissolve the Levirate marriage. So if they had gotten married and she is a minor, but we know she potentially has the right of refusal, but then her husband dies and leaves no children, then she indeed becomes the Yevamot. She is now bound to the husband through the Levirate bond. What Beit Shammai is saying is she has the right to refuse her first husband, who's now deceased, but once Yibum kicks in, she does not have the right to refuse to do Yibum. Now, she has the right to go through Khalitza. Indeed, that's what is done because the first marriage was not a fully attained marriage because of the age, but she can't use the more sweeping, clean slate version of refusal. She has to use Khalitza for the dissolving of that levirate bond. Does everyone make sense?
Yeah, Rabbi.
And
Shamai,
by the way, as we saw back in chapter 12, that means we have to wait for her to become a bat mitzvah. She has to become a no longer a minor. She has to reach the age of majority, I think is the English phrase. Yes, Aaron.
So basically, Shamai says there is a situation where the girl could lose her free will to make a decision.
Well, yes. I mean, we all have those situations where we are now stuck with the consequences of life. And he is saying that despite the weaker nature of the bond that exists between her and her husband, because of the status of being not only a minor, but a minor who was put in the situation, by her mother or brother, nevertheless, Yibum, when it kicks in, that does have a stronger bond and therefore can only be dissolved by Khalitza. And therefore, we have to wait for her to be an adult to dissolve that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just wanted to clarify that the opinion of Shamai was there is a situation where she could lose her free will to decide who to marry. Or,
right. Well, she would lose the right to marry someone else for a short while.
Right, but Khalitza would give her the status of a divorcee.
Which does have a semi-divorcee, as we saw in the earlier chapters, but yes, it does have implications for other status issues. But Beit Hillel says it may be directed at her husband or her Yavam. That no, her right of refusal remains intact when dealing with either her husband or, if he dies, with his brother, the Yavam, and therefore she can dissolve the relationship with the Yavam through refusal. She doesn't have to wait to do it through Khalitza. Make sense?
Yeah. Hey, Rabbi, one final question though.
Don't only say only, not final. We always have time for more questions.
But yeah, when we were talking about earlier about the reasoning for the laws, and apparently the right of the refusal is to give choice to the female, whether or not to marry. Does that have anything to do with somebody just strictly applying the rules without looking to the reasoning versus somebody looking to the reasoning and making sure they apply?
I'm not 100% sure I follow the question, but I would just want to tweak one part of the original statement that you made, which is it's not about giving her the right to make those choices. It's about recognizing that she has that right, and under all the circumstances that we're describing, that right cannot be taken away from her. Right? It's not about giving, it's about not canceling that right. Does that distinction make sense?
Yeah,
right?
But it seems like
it's not that the rabbi sat down and said, how can we give women more rights? It's the rabbi sat down and said, she has the right to refuse. Under what circumstances might that get messed up?
All right. Yeah, that makes sense. It just seems like I was just wondering if sometimes people just want to apply the procedural application of the rule without looking at the reasoning for the rule.
Well, I mean, certainly that does happen in many conversations regarding halakha of people who see a result and think that applies across the board in every situation without recognizing that there are many different underlying issues involved that can change drastically. I like to use the example of the border of a fractal image. If you've ever seen a fractal, which is a pattern which repeats at any scale in which you zoom in and out, when you're at a certain level, it will look like you can see a border between, let's say, a dark and a light shape. You can see the edge between them. But if you zoom in, you'll find that border is actually much more ornate, much more intricate then it looked at a higher level of observation. And so, yes, you need to know all the particulars, because while it may look black and white at a certain level, with enough zooming in, you may notice that on a particular, you're actually moving from black to white to black. And so that's why Judaism is always so careful to try and get to the details of any particular case, and to look through all of these extreme cases to make sure that if those particulars will matter, we're aware of how they would matter. So yeah, Judaism doesn't really go in for one size fits all. All right, next conflict between the two of them. Beit Shammai says refusal may be directed only at her husband. Sorry, I already read that one. It's the beginning of the two different versions. Beit Shammai says the refusal must take place specifically in the presence of the husband. Now, the idea here is that she has to actually be talking to the husband, as opposed to talking to a third party, which Beit Hillel says it may take place either in his presence or in his absence, meaning that she can take and say, I refuse to marry him, even if he's not standing in the room. That is, it's her right to be able to say it, regardless of whether he is there or not. Obviously, he will have to be informed, but she doesn't need to inform him to his face, if you will. Everybody follow that? Okay. Beit Shammai says the refusal must take place specifically in court, but Beit Hillel says it may take place either in court or not in court. There does still need to be witnesses, but they don't need to be of the same caliber as a full dayan or somebody that is of a higher rabbinic level of training. And indeed, the halakha ends up saying that even if it is just in front of two valid witnesses, that it still counts as a valid refusal.
Did the refusal have to be in front of three?
So ideally, it would be done in front of three, but the Talmud clarifies that if it's done in front of two, because the halakha does follow Beit Hillel, that it would still be valid.
But you need at least two because of the commandment that upon two witnesses shall you sustain?
In general, yes. For Jewish law, you always need two witnesses. Okay, let me make sure I'm starting with the right sentence, because we keep bumping back and forth between these two houses.
Rabbi,
yes.
How come it's two for the refusal, but one to release somebody from death, from their husband dying?
So the case of agunot, where a woman is married to somebody who then is said to have died, as we saw, first of all, that can lead to some very nasty complications if the process is done hastily, and the acceptance of one person's testimony is not done just carte blanche. One guy showed up randomly and said, oh, by the way, Joe Levy died, but instead there needs to be more investigation to corroborate that. But the main issue there was that there were grounds to believe it. After all, he's not there. And there was a need to clarify her status so that she not remain bound to somebody that had been dead. And that would have dissolved the relationship and thus allow her to move on.
But isn't there that similar need to make sure she's not bound to somebody she wanted to refuse?
Right, but there's also the similar need not to make sure that somebody who's married is being permitted to someone else.
Right,
so
but you could do both.
It's not actually hard to get two witnesses together in front of the girl and have her say, I refuse. It is hard to sometimes get two witnesses together from, let's say, a battlefield and say, I saw Joe Levy get killed. That is a much heavier burden to accomplish. But having her simply stand in front of two Jewish people and say, I refuse to marry that guy, that should not be a difficult thing to accomplish. And so it's not really a barrier to releasing her. Does that distinction make some sense?
Yeah,
The
that's
whole
actually
point
what
of the
I thought it was.
agonot is that the husband has vanished and cannot be found, cannot be witnessed, he cannot be observed, and that it happened in that way because he drowned at sea. He was swept over by a wave, or he was killed in a battle, and everyone else fled, and no one could go back to recover the body. There is no, well, how about we just have her say it in front of two people as a solution? It is impossible to get additional eyewitness testimony in those cases. If there is, then great, we've got it, and it's even easier to release the woman from being married to somebody who has died. Okay. Beit Hillel said to Beit Shamai, let's get that centered. She may refuse as long as she is a minor, even 4 or 5 times. If her relatives married her off, again to one after another, after each refusal, that's fine. So what Beit Hillel is saying is that the family has the right to marry her multiple times if she keeps refusing. So they betroth her and she refuses. They betroth her and she refuses. They betroth her and she refuses. That those 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5 consecutive betrothals are still fine and valid. Beit Shammai said to them, the daughters of Israel are not to be treated with disregard and should not be passed from one man to another. Rather, she refuses once, and then she must wait until she reaches majority and refuse and marry. Meaning that once she has refused, her relationship is dissolved, and then once she has reached majority and confirmed indeed that she is not going to be married to that guy, she can marry anyone else, but the family does not have the right to do an additional betrothal while she is still a minor. They get one shot at this, and if she refuses, then that's the last chance for it. Questions or comments? Okay. Where's my mouse? Yeah, you know what? I bet we can get this in. Just trying to remind myself of the ones that come after. Yeah, let's do 3. Or are we on 2 here? 2. Sorry, let's do 2 from chapter 13, and then we'll call it a night. Who is a minor girl who needs to perform refusal in order to annul her marriage? Gee, wouldn't it have been nice to have had this before we started? But we're now going to get a description that basically is going to show you a lot of the pieces that I mentioned earlier before we began chapter 13. Any minor whose mother or brother married her off with her consent. Right? That is a girl who is eligible to refuse. If her mother or brother married her off with her consent, she can say, no, I don't want to marry, even at a later time while still a minor, or when she reaches the age of bat mitzvah. If they married her off without her consent, she need not refuse her husband at all and may leave her husband without a declaration of refusal. So what we're going to discover is that there are 3 levels of getting out of a marriage. There is a get, which is the divorce document that is the usual way of dissolving a marriage between a husband and wife that are of full adulthood and normal marriage process. There is refusal, which is what we've been talking about so far. And then there is, you don't even need to refuse. If you didn't consent to this in the first place, you've got nothing to refuse because there was never an actual betrothal or marriage because you never agreed to it. And she can just walk out without needing any additional ritual or dissolution or statement to end that marriage.
But you can walk away if after become to be an adult or also as a minor.
This is as a minor, yeah.
So as a minor, still you can walk away.
Yep.
But as a minor, you are still under the influence of your parents or your mom and your big brother. So where would you go?
Okay. So this comes back to our opening topic of Fiddler on the Roof and Tevye and all of that. In the classic world, pre-modern world, the family and community had pressure, social pressure, not halachic pressure, which sometimes would coerce both men and women to join in marriages that neither one of them really wanted. Now, it might have officially been done without their consent, but they consent de facto after the fact because they know that if they refuse, their family will be upset, their family will cast them out, their family will not keep them anymore, that no one else will marry them. And in many towns and villages, that would be a big problem. Not just the social damage done to you by being cut out from your family, but also the simple survival fact, as we talked about before, of needing a partner in life in order to be able to meet the basic demands of living in the pre-modern world. So that is not legal power. The family doesn't have the right to force her to marry without her consent and keep her there against her will. However, the social pressure would twist many arms in the pre-modern world. And many people ended up in marriages they really did not want and legally did not have to remain in, but they stayed anyway because of that family and social pressure, which is a shame. Partly because it confuses people and they read, or watch Fiddler on the Roof and think that that's what Judaism as a legal system believed, rather than recognizing that it was representative of the social conventions of the community, not the legal conventions of Judaism. But we don't always live up to the best of our law. Sometimes the community takes matters into their own hands and does not do a good job of representing what the law is trying to accomplish. Rabbi Hanina ben Antigonus says, any girl who is so young that she cannot keep her betrothal, meaning the money or document of her betrothal, safe, does not need to refuse. So now we are clarifying that if she is so little that she can't even hold on to her ketubah or hold on to the money that is gifted to her by her husband, that you wouldn't trust her to hold on to it and keep it safe, then that's too young to even need to refuse, which would mean she can technically walk away at any point at all. She was too young to really understand. She was too young to give consent, and therefore she doesn't need to give non-consent to walk away. She can refuse without even making a formal declaration, if you will.
Oh,
As
Rabbi,
sages,
isn't there...
Sorry, just to finish the comment here, as the sages instituted marriage only for a girl old enough to understand what she is doing. Go ahead.
Didn't the rabbis, isn't there non-consent in all these cases because they're underage and the father or so-and-so is marrying them off?
No, that's not the implication at all. It's not full legal consent, which is why refusal is allowed and why there are these transition periods when they move to adulthood. But it is still considered to be for a child who's on the older end of the spectrum, the one that does know how to keep track of the ketubah and the money that comes to her from her betrothed, that she is able to make some decisions. Yes, those decisions are not normally legally binding, which Rabbi Elazar is going to bring up in just a second. But that is still with a personal consent, even if it's not the standard level of routine adult legal consent. So yes, there is consent used in two different ways. There is the, does she agree to this? And there's, does what she actually says matter? Because she's not old enough to really count as a person who says things in a legally binding way. The same way that an 8-year-old, if somebody gives him a car, in Jewish law, does not legally have the right to sell the car because he doesn't have the right to enter into transactions, which also protects him, of course, keeping somebody from unscrupulously buying the car from him and taking advantage of him.
So Rabbi, she does have some consent in this. There is some consent that she's engaged in when the father promises her in marriage. Because I thought the whole point of refusal was she didn't consent to it.
No, refusal can be a simple act of changing her mind. It doesn't have to be that she refused it from the outset.
Right, but I didn't know she could refuse it from the outset. She can though, huh?
Yes.
But if she doesn't refuse it from the outset, then she has to refuse it
right, she can still back out later, yes. Natan, were you going to say something too?
So for what I understood, okay, a minor cannot have a get. Only an adult can have a get. And minor can be or refuser or ignoring.
No, actually, we're going to see, although probably not tonight, well, definitely not tonight, looking at the clock, we are going to see that the husband of this minor can dissolve the marriage with a get. That is possible, but that is in his court, whereas the refusal is in her court. So it means she gets to make a decision of whether she wants to refuse or not. He can make a decision of whether he wants to divorce through the traditional means of a get.
Okay. By the way, this is today the last class before July?
Yes, exactly.
Oh.
That
so
was
now
my...
we need to wait the answer and the example of the get until
well, I mean, you can wait for me to study it together with, but technically you can read ahead, and that's perfectly fine. But yes, as far as our class goes, once we finish Mishnah 2, we're not going to be able to see each other again until, hold on, let me just check my calendar very quickly. It would be, actually, no, I think I will be back on the 30th, June 30th. But let's finish up chapter Mishnah 2 from chapter 13. And hold on, I need to get back on the right page and see what Rabbi Elazar is trying to add to our argument here. Rabbi Elazar says, the act of a minor girl is nothing. So that if a minor girl's mother or brother marry her off, the marriage is essentially invalid. Rather, her status is as though she were a seduced, unmarried woman. Therefore, the implications are a minor daughter of a non-priest married to a priest may not eat truma, and the minor daughter of a priest married to an Israelite man may eat truma. So this gets into a much longer argument and discussion in the Talmud about what exactly is the obligation and the connection between a minor and her husband if it's under this being married off by the mother and brother situation. And what he is trying to highlight here is that there are some limitations where she doesn't actually count like the full wife of the husband. And the specific case that's most illustrative of that is that she can't eat from the truma if she is a non-priest, meaning she doesn't become enough of his wife to get access to the truma, which is, of course, biblically offered only to the family of the Kohanim.
Because she's a minor.
Well, it's not just because she's a minor, but it's because the marriage is not quite significant enough legally to give her permission to something that the Torah forbids. Right? The Torah says if you're not part of the family of the Kohanim, either by birth or by marriage, you don't have the right to eat truma. And what he's pointing out is that this marriage is not equal to the prohibition. So it can't override the prohibition by making her enough of a wife to give her access. And vice versa, if she is a Kohen, right, meaning the daughter of a priest, and she is married to an Israelite, she still counts as enough of the Kohen's family that she doesn't lose her permission to eat from her father's household, from the household of the Kohanim.
And the husband will not receive any truma.
No, of course not. In the second case, in the first case, he's a Kohen, so he gets it like normal. But in the second case, he would not get truma because of her. And once she's an adult and they're fully married, she won't get truma anymore either.
Yeah. Okay.
Aaron, did you have a question?
Yes, Rabbi. So it seems like these marriages are about on par with a betrothal then, huh? Right.
In some ways, yes. I mean, and that's why he's using the case of a seduced unmarried woman, right? That's a technical term. It's not meant to be about what's their relationship like. About the case of a woman who had been seduced, meaning taken advantage of by someone in a way that was duplicitous and inappropriate, that it does create a certain bond, but it is not finished until a proper marriage is done. And that's why he's using that as a comparison.
And in fact, it seems like it's even less than a betrothal, because you need a get to dissolve a betrothal.
Yes. Like I said, we are going to find out that the husband could give a get to her, but we do have this other exit through refusal. All right. So we are going to leave it there, well, for a month. And we're going to come back to this issue when we get back together again on June 30th. Thank you all for studying. I really look forward to our Wednesday sessions, and I will see you. Well, I'm sure it'll feel like time just flies. So June 30th, we'll be back at our regular time. If you're on the TI WhatsApp, let me know. I'll make sure to post that. And if not,
Yes.
Keep an eye on the calendar. Keep an eye on all the other places where we announce those things. Yes, Natan.
No, me not. I will see you almost at the end of July. But have a safe vacation or trip if you are taking. Enjoy your vacation.
Thank you. But aren't you available on Sunday for our time?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So I'll see you then. And then
Yeah.
after that, I know you have your trip, and then yes, I've got my vacation too.
Okay. So Sunday is the last day that I will see you before your vacation.
Exactly. Yes.
Perfect.
All right, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Be well.
Enjoy.
And, I'll see you all soon.
Thanks,
Enjoy
guys.
your
Thank you
vacation.
for the show.
Right.